Um, yeah, so we're coming up on almost 2 hours already, so I'm going to move us ahead to kind of the rapid-fire questions that I have at the end, which is simply, with a bunch of different things, would you see these as being contradictory to your face to participate in them? So we've already talked about voting a fair bit. I think all of us would say it's not contradictory, although some of us maybe in some cases wouldn't, some cases would. Is that a correct statement? Would anybody say that it is flat out contradictory to vote?
No.
Yeah, I
Nope.
don't think it's antithetical to Christianity to vote, personally.
Okay. How about being a part of the military?
About participating in the military, you said?
Yeah, being a participant in the military.
I'll say no, only because I think being a part of the military raises interesting ethical issues about how you're not in control of your own destiny. Like, you have to just follow orders, and often you can never judge in a situation like a course of action. Like, I'm even talking like if you're the chef or if you're like the boat captain. If you never actually have to fire the firearm, I still think you're in a realm of subjugation that's conflicting, that you may even have to perform tasks without knowing the consequences of your action. And just because of that, I think it's a difficult position. So I'll say no.
I will say this, all right? And I've been wrestling with in the Black community. Many people have joined the military as a means out of deep poverty, right? Now, I'll be like the first one trying to convince people not to, right? But again, I guess what I'm thinking about is, and this is why it goes back to like my comments about pacifism versus peacemaking, how I'm using the terms, right? Maybe not how you guys would use the terms, that's how I use the terms. But like a pure stance versus like the messiness, like when one's life is just caught up in just a cycle of violence and chaos, right? And trying to find a way out sometimes, maybe, and I don't know. I'm almost arguing against myself here, but sometimes, I wonder if there's ways in which people use these systems against themselves, right? For other means. I don't know. I'm not an advocate for military involvement. So I don't know. I'm just trying to stretch us to think a little bit, at least to be maybe not so condemning, because I think some people make these choices not because they want to serve the military, but because they're stuck in cycles of poverty, and that's the only option they have. And I think I'm a little bit less willing to be so harsh on people who make that decision, even Christians. But in the grand scheme, it's just messy. I guess that's my point. Yeah.
I'm going to tell the story of my grandfather real briefly here from World War II. Rather than getting into something like 1W service, which is an out that we have in the United States to avoid the draft, to be able to get into a service which would be supporting things within the military programs and within the government programs here. Some of that would have to do with psychiatric hospitals, and would have to do with support crew on the ground and the bases here in the U.S. My grandfather took what was called a farm deferment, where basically he said, I am going to go work on a farm and support agriculture here in the U.S. Rather than take in any kind of military service. And that for him, that was a step downward in society. My aunt and my dad tell stories of them basically living in poverty during World War II while my grandfather worked on his brother's farm for pittance. To be able to take that particular stance of not participating in the military and actually going to the direction of taking a personal sacrifice in the process. And again, that was a matter of principle, that they saw it as, even if I am working in a military hospital saving lives, for what purpose am I saving those lives? the purpose for saving those lives is to patch up these kids and throw them back into the fray. Just watch Pierce, Hawkeye Pierce in the TV series MASH. That was his conundrum that he constantly worked through and worked against in his life. This is not to say I'm with Drew that I'm not going to necessarily condemn somebody who wants to join the military, because there's more reasons to condemn to join the military than just to go because you want to go kill people. I know of a young man who, again, as Drew said, his only out, the only job he could find was in the diplomatic corps through the military service to act as a translator to Hong Kong. Because he spoke fluent Chinese, and rather than continuing to struggle with minimum wage jobs and such here in the U.S., he joined the military to be able to put his skills to work in a way that he wasn't being sent into the fray to kill people, but he was actually working on a core of peacemaking, of actually entering into conversations and those kinds of things. So, personally, I would not join the military. I don't think that is necessarily a place where I feel that we could do kingdom work, especially if we're called to love our enemies sacrificially. But I am also not necessarily going to condemn somebody just because they join the military and say that, nope, you're going to hell. I don't think that's my place to call it, because it's messier than that, a lot messier.
I'll just quickly add to that. I wouldn't condemn them either. I was just trying to answer personally where I would come from.
I definitely wouldn't join the military myself, but not much else to add.
Yeah, and I think that you all raised a very good point. I think at a principle level, Christians should not join the military, but as you talked about, some people basically have to, and it's similar to other jobs or other duties that are morally wrong, but that people, especially people living in poverty, people suffering from the discrimination, get into anyway. Like, for example, prostitution, and you have to handle that in different ways. And when it comes to policing, I think it's actually quite similar to military. Obviously, in ancient Rome, the soldiers were the policemen, and today we have made this distinction when the police use less violence theoretically, but as we've seen in the US especially, there's so much police violence that is very unrighteous and that hits the black community the most. I would say that on a principle level, I think it's the same thing here, that Christians should avoid the police career, because it necessarily brings violence. You know, most policemen have a gun, and as pacifist Christians, we should avoid that and try to make society more secure by evangelism and activism rather than policing.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing, which is I do wonder, like, what it would look like for someone to become a police officer but not assume the role. You know what I mean? But to really try to be a peacemaker, to take a vow to not use violence, but to literally try to transform conflict. You know what I mean? Like, I think in that sense that could be a really beautiful thing, but that would in some sense be a rejection of the actual task that they've been given, which historically in the black community, I mean, it's from slavery, slave patrols, all the way up to the present, it's been controlling the populace, and so you have to refuse and reject your very task and your role and your duties and how you're supposed to be carrying it out. But I wouldn't necessarily demonize somebody in and of itself because they were a police officer. I would just say that the very role, that the script that they're supposed to play, is a troublesome one, is a problematic one, and so they have to reject that script and live into a new one that is peacemaking.
Yeah. So I'll reply to that. Drew, what would you think about like a British Bobby? You know, these comical officers that walk around just with a little nightstick, flashlights. They don't even have a gun. They mostly just talk people down and have tea with people. Could you see yourself being like a British Bobby?
Well, I don't know if I'd see myself doing that, but and even hey, like I've seen my own neighbor almost get cracked upside the head by 2 white police on my block, with some nightsticks out. So even that can do some damage. But I don't really know enough to really speak into that to say. But for me, it's just really about the role that one is playing. I think that if it's about, I think some of the challenge also is that police come into communities and it's about asserting control and authority over others, right? And I think that very posture is a Christian posture. It's not a Jesus-shaped posture. And so I think, again, I think you can't live into that role, into that script of police officer as it is imagined. But if we could reimagine a peacemaking kind of way of life, of engaging communities and conflict within our communities, I think that something else could be very possible. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you. If there was a way of constructing a police position that it was more peacemaker, that it was kind of a commitment to preserve life, no matter what. Like you could think of all the hundreds of ways that an officer could not just even carry a gun, right? Like I know here in Canada, the very idea that a police officer would have to draw a gun would make national news. It would make, guaranteed. If there was a story where a police officer in this country had to draw his gun, everyone in the country would know about it. Whereas in the American context, it's just like, what? That's what you did, like that afternoon. I'm exaggerating, I'm sure, but if there was the sense of like creating a culture of peacemaking, I'm on board with you. I could imagine that. Like, what if you had someone go into a situation, guy's beating up his wife, he's got a knife to her throat or something like that, and they just go there and they talk him down. Whoa, you don't want to do this, buddy. You don't want to. I know here in Canada, much of the RCMP's skills are often just in diplomatic, just talking people down and then kind of taking them away, as well as they have a host of other tools in their tool belt. They have like pepper spray, they have like a taser, when used properly can kind of do that. They have a measure of physical force, kind of like even in Aikido. What I would like to see is that at least kind of have those conversations about at least de-escalating the violence in police forces that we have now, right? Like that would at least be a huge victory for Americans, I'm sure.
Absolutely, yeah.
Just 2 more quick ones, and you can answer these fairly quickly. Just yes, no, if you can boil it down that simply. So would you consider it, contrary to your faith, a clash of conscience to be an elected representative? And would it be different depending on the levels of government or anything like that?
I would struggle with state or federal level.
I would say no, not qualified.
I think I'm with Tabitha. I think the national level, I don't know. I don't see how you can, in America, be faithful and do your job. But I think on very local levels, I think it's possible, maybe. I don't know. I have no aspirations for that, but I think it's possible.
Yeah, I would be personally, I could see it happening so long as you could divest yourself from all use of violence. Like if you could do that, which I don't think can happen on a national level, which even in a state level is questioning, maybe it's just best to like stick to like Parks and Rec. I don't know, that kind of sounds like a good idea.
That was actually pretty much my next question. Would it be a clash of conscience to be in a non-partisan government job, like working for your tax agency?
I don't think so. As long as you're not like doing violence, right? Like taking care of the roads and parks and schools. I think that's one of our commitments, even if we were Christians. If we remember, a lot of Christians were the ones that they began hospitals, they began systems of education, and the state took those over. So to me, it seems like, well, why not just? That implies like an ability to at least be involved in those. If we could do those independently of the state.
The counterpoint I was thinking of for that would simply be, like with the tax example, it is still use of force that enforces the tax laws that you're working on. So you could make that argument. I don't think I would make that argument. I would be okay with it, but I was wondering if anybody here would.
That's a tricky one. At what point in time are you relying on the force of empire in order to be able to make it possible to even do your job? I mean, even when it comes to parks and recs, you're still kind of in some way enforcing laws and regulations that if somebody is violating those, you may have to call in the police to enforce something that you need to be able to do. The question is always going to be there. At what point engage from the society around us? How deep does my involvement in empire go when I take that public role?
I'm obviously a public school teacher, so the question is very applicable, and I hope that if I ever needed to, I'd be willing to sacrifice my job if it went against my conscience.
So we did get one question submitted through the Q&A, which I think is a nice wrapping things up kind of question. So what are Jesus's politics today? How do we live into his government kingdom now?
I mean, I would say they're the same as they were then. I don't know. I'm like, I don't know what it's a question. I think Jesus' politics is, that he's come to set the oppressed free and to proclaim the year of Jubilee. And so I think it's the same as it was then. I think it's that he's about inaugurating a kingdom here, very political, social, spiritual, everything, right? All comprehensive kingdom here on earth that we are supposed to participate in, that we're supposed to live and make that kingdom visible. And by doing that, we make the story of Jesus visible for our neighbors. We bear witness. We prophetically call out, our empires and the ways that they are blasphemous whores at times, or if they're being more behaving, and I think there's times in which we can live very peaceably with them. But I think that the question for me has never really been what does it mean now. It's just us really taking seriously what it meant in the gospel story and then applying it for now. And I think that has always been a harder thing. That I think we've missed a lot of it for many of us. I don't know. That's my thoughts. I'd love to hear what you guys think.
That while we have the blessing of living towards our faith, living in such a situation. If I didn't have the freedom to participate in government, if I was being persecuted, interacting with these for the people around me, those are the priority, because as much as we may enjoy the country that we live in, we've been in here for about 200 and some odd years. That's a good long run, but I'm pretty convinced that the United States is not going to last forever. That there will come a time when this country will collapse. And when it does, what kind of actions am I going to want to be involved in? And those are the kinds of actions that I want to be involved in today as well. That no matter what the government is over me, what am I supposed to be doing? So that's what I see Jesus' politics as today. Yeah, we can get involved in government in and out depending upon gradations of convictions and everything like that. But what ultimately am I supposed to be involved in today, even if I didn't have a friendly government over me, and prioritize those actions over anything else?
So I had the exact same thought as Drew, like, well, it's not like it's different today. It's what it was then. And so I immediately kind of thinking back to, you know, what is the kingdom of God? What were Jesus's politics? You know, I kind of thought about this book. Actually, during our whole conversation, I've had this book beside me. I know it's controversial. The author's controversial, but if you're an Anabaptist, you've heard of this book, right? Like, so we can talk about that another time, right? But yeah, Jesus has a politics. There's a politics where, you know, the poor are blessed. It's a politics where the meek inherit the earth. That's a good book, Michael. He's showing up the book, The Myth of a Christian Nation, right? Anyway, sorry, I'm getting distracted by looking at him. Jesus has a politics where blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the merciful. These are kind of politics that Jesus has. Jesus has a politics that according to Paul in his writings, tear down the walls of hostility between ethnic divisions, between social divisions. According to Paul, there is no Jew nor Gentile, there is no slave nor free, there is no male nor female. That's a political statement, right? And so when we live in that today, it's promoting those kind of cultures, of setting up what I like to call like ambassadorships or kind of embassies of the kingdoms in our church. So I put it like this: when I was in London, in England, visiting, I was in Trafalgar Square, and right next to Trafalgar Square, there's this amazing building. It's massive, and it's the Canadian Embassy. And when I go in there, they stamp my passport, and I'm literally and legally on Canadian soil. And everything there, you know, if it happens there, it happened in Canada. And I kind of think, like, I like to take that embassy imagery and take it with me, like, on how I live my life and what the church represents. Like, the church is, you know, every church building you see in the world is technically an embassy for the kingdom of God, of a new way of ordering, of a way we receive each other in our social practices within the church. So I think very much of the work of Blacktivism. Sorry, Drew, just giving a nod to you there. You know, how we structure our churches says a lot about our political beliefs, right? How we welcome races amongst our church, how we receive people at the communion table. I mean, those are things that we live into now. We live into alternative realities. We live into new ways of living right now. So, yeah, and just kind of going back to what others have said, that is a reality that Jesus broke forward in his life, death, and resurrection. So, yeah.
I would echo what everyone else said. I would maybe word it, say that the primary focus of God's kingdom is to focus on people's spiritual needs, setting the oppressed free from sin. And secondly, I think just reemphasize that ultimately our trust is in God and not in politics.
That is a great point to close on. So, just do a quick round off. Where can we find all of your work if we want to learn more about what you're up to? We'll start with Drew.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Drew Hart, DRUHART. I blog for Christian Century. My book is called Taking Jesus Seriously. And you can keep an eye out for my new book coming out in January. It's called Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism. And so that'll be coming out with Herald Press in January. Thanks.
Okay. Paul?
Yeah, you can find me at Twitter at PaulWalker87. It's the original Paul Walker Twitter handle was taken for some reason. I don't know why. No idea. And you can find me at my blog, which is pauldouglaswalker.blogspot.ca. And if you're in Canada, if you're near the Winnipeg region, you can find me in a little community called Rose Isle.
Where can we find you online, Robert?
I'm blog at Abnormal Anabaptist, WordPress, WordPress.com. You can find me on Twitter at Tristan Ogre, on Facebook.
Okay, and
I blog at ultimatemetaphor.blogspot.com, and I've really enjoyed this conversation, so thanks for facilitating, Ryan.
you're very welcome. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to Micael, who unfortunately has popped out with technical issues, but he's at Holy Spirit Activism. And I'm Ryan Robinson. You can check out my blog at anabaptistredux.com, or as part of the MennoNerds network, which is where you can learn more about all of the things that we are doing together as a collective. That's MennoNerds.com, and it's on Twitter and on Facebook and lots of other places.